Welcome to Victims of Communist Memorial Foundation Cuba Communist Threat webinars and this series of special programs devoted to analyze the Cuba communist regime and the impact from this regime in the rest of the world, in Latin America, how this regime has been exporting false international medical missions to support COVID-19 and how this has been having a major impact not only in Cuba, it also has an impact outside Cuba, how some country has been supporting this terrible regime in Cuba while people has been persecuted, people continue to be in Cuba prisons or under house arrest or tortured by the regime. Too many decades, and we continue having this the oldest tyranny in the region. With us today, we have Rosa María Payá. Rosa María Payá, she's a good friend. Rosa María Payá is only 31, 32 years old. I have the pleasure and the honor to share some platform with Rosa María Payá, some common fight in my 30 years plus working with Cuba. She has been a fresh air in the fight for democracy in Cuba. She's the daughter of a good friend of Oswaldo Payá, who was killed by the Cuban regime in July 2012. Oswaldo was fighting for a change in Cuba, internal in Cuba, traveling around Cuba. And Rosa María Payá had the honor, but at the same time, the challenge. And I believe that she has been doing an extraordinary job. And in 2013, just a month after the regime killed her dad, she went to the UN Human Rights Council to denounce the regime. And she has been active since then, actively engagement in the international community, putting pressure at the UN, putting pressure at the OAS, having meetings directly with several presidents, parliaments, members of Congress, and different civil society organizations to change the perception of Cuba, to show the world that that is not acceptable to have the longest gerontocratic and absolute no democracy in Cuba. Rosa María Payá was the head of the Latin American Youth Movement for Democracy, which inspired a number of youth people to fight for democracy in the region, in other countries like Venezuela, Nicaragua, and working in the whole region. And she's the head of Cuba Decide, a fresh initiative to promote democracy in Cuba. Well, Rosa María, it is an honor for Victims of Communist Memorial Foundation to have you here and to have the opportunity to learn from you about the struggle for democracy in Cuba and how we can get rid of this dictatorship. Welcome. So please let us know how is the struggle for democracy in Cuba, how we can defeat this terrible regime.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Carlos, for that wonderful presentation. And you give me a lot of credit. And thank you so much also to you for your work, for accompanying us, the Cuban people, in our struggle for freedom. And of course, thank you so much to the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation for providing this platform to get to explain a little bit what is the situation in Cuba, how we could united actually overcome this threat. That is not just a threat against the Cuban people, that is not just undermining the ability to pursue happiness of the Cuban people, but also of the rest of the region, and that is actually also a threat for the people in United States. And I'm talking about the activity of the Cuban dictatorship, the criminal activities of the Castro regime. And I will talk a little bit about what initiative we have to help the Cuban people, about also the conditions in which the Cuban people are now suffering and struggling because of the big crisis that we faced in the island. And I will also mention, because I think it's a very important topic, and victims of communism have been very active in denouncing the criminal activities regarding the human trafficking using the Cuban doctors and the Cuban medical professionals abroad. And I will finish with some remarks about what we can do inside and outside the island, and also all those that are right now watching or that could watch this interview in the future, what anyone can do to help to stop this threat, which is actually, as we'll see, a very essential element, a root in the instability in the whole region, in the Americas. So whenever you want, just interrupt me and make questions, please. And of course, in 20 minutes or so, we'll be answering questions from anyone that wants to talk with us. And I would like to start by announcing to those that don't know that we as Cubans, and especially the Cubans in the diaspora, we started an initiative called Solidarity Among Brothers, which aims to send humanitarian aid to the island. I have to say that the generosity of the Cuban people, of that part of the Cuban nation that live abroad, that live outside the country, has been overwhelming. We have received a lot of humanitarian aid that we are trying right now to send to the island in a midst of an environment of attacks from the part of the regime, of attack from their propaganda machinery, but also from their cyber hackers that have been attacking, for instance, our website, trying to prevent that the people in the island register to demand that help. And I have to say that even in the middle of these attacks, and when I say attack, I'm talking about DDoS attacks, the kind of cyber attacks that we have received, and the amount of attacks in 2 hours, just to give us an idea of how big is the machinery of the regime. The amount of the attacks was around 33,000 attacks in just 2 hours, trying to prevent the Cuban in the island to register to get that aid. And why we are we that are mainly opposition members and people that is actually trying to generate a democratic change, why we are also collecting humanitarian aid, because the crisis inside the island is getting worse and worse. The tendency to the worsening is a very worrying right now. And in the middle of this crisis, the intensification of the repression by the authorities of the dictatorship and the, of course, subsequent increase of the risk of COVID-19 contagions from the citizens is something that is also in an alarming way increasing. Actually, we try to alert in first place the Cuban people, but also the international community about this crisis that in any moment could get to the point of not return, could get to the point in which it's not going to be handleable for any of the members of the society, not even for the dictatorship. And while the number of Cuban people infected with COVID-19 increased, the repression of the dictatorship also increased. We are talking about people that is being beaten in the streets, that has been arrested, that have been stripped from their cell phones physically, just for the act of taking a peek of an agglomeration to get food in Cuba. The lack of food, the shortage of any hygiene products, the lack of hygiene in public spaces, the lack of hygiene in the hospitals, including the hospital inside the prisons. All these factors are getting so worse and worse as we talk, and as the COVID-19 increases in the contagions of COVID-19 increases among society, that the amount of ask for help that we are receiving from the Cuban people is unprecedented, at least in my experience in the recent years. And I have to say, Carlos, that this crisis didn't begin with the COVID-19 pandemic that is actually affecting the whole globe right now. This crisis began with the imposition of the Cuban dictatorship. The lack of food, the lack of hygiene conditions have been Cuban people for decades right now. But what we are facing in this moment inside the island is a situation in which not only the freedom, not only democracy is undermined or non-existent in the island. What we're facing right now is a threat of life of many Cuban families. And while while the life of the Cuban families is increasingly difficult, the regime used their propaganda machinery in two very perverse ways. The first one, against their own people, against the Cuban people, trying to portray the rest of the world as and especially countries as the United States or European countries, as if they were worse and actually suffering much more than the Cuban people, and also in a way trying to appease the Cuban citizens, lying about the real penetration of the contagions in the island. The numbers that they are given are so twisted, are so mockery of the society, that actually, and just to give you an example of how wrong are the statistics of the government, a few weeks ago, when they were reporting the amount of people that have died in the island as a result of the COVID-19, from one day to the other, the amount of dead people decreased in 2 persons. That's the way in which the Cuban regime actually provides statistics to the people, but also to the international community. And this is the second more worrying part, because as the Cuban people is suffering, also suffering from insufficient medical attention, also suffering from the lack of medical personnel in the hospitals and in the public health facilities in the island, while the Cuban people is suffering the lack of sanitary conditions in the hospitals. While all this is happening, and to give you an idea of how worse the situation is, the Cuban regime is forcing the medical students to visit house by house, asking for sick people in a very questionable method, given the risk of infection of COVID-19, but they have to use the students because of the lack of doctors in the island. And while all this is taking place on the island, they are selling doctors to the international community, and they are using their propaganda to portray themselves as a kind of charity organization that is giving medical professionals to other countries, not just Latin American countries, not just Caribbean countries, even European countries, while the Cuban people is suffering because of the insufficient medical attention inside the island. And before going in detail about what these communist medical brigades actually do outside Cuba in each country in which they get, I have to say and to express here that all these calamities that the Cuban people is experiencing, all the suffering, all the lack of rights that is actually the base of the suffering of our people, didn't start 2 months ago, or with COVID-19, or with Raúl Castro, have been there for decades. And the fact that the rest of the world, and especially our region, the big democracies that are in our region, the fact that those democracies have tolerated the existence of a criminal dictatorship in the island of Cuba for 6 decades now, have been the essential element of the undermining of the democracy and the stability and the well-being of many other citizens in our region. And Venezuela is the most illustrative example of that, but it's not the unique example. It's not exclusively the people of Venezuela, the ones that have suffered the imposition of a regime similar to the Cuban regime and coordinated by the Cuban regime. And we'll talk also about that. But the Cuban doctors have been used by the Cuban regime, to be more specific, because not only doctors travel in these Cuban Communist medical brigades, also agents of intelligence travel, also people that actually are not doctors travels too. And what is very important, and is my first point here, because we are talking about tens of thousands of Cuban doctors or Cuban professionals that have been working abroad during the last decades, not only in the region, but in several countries in the world. One of the missions of these brigades is directly undermine the foreign state security of these countries, undermine democracy in these countries, and try to penetrate the social tissues, the social organizations, the basis of the political parties. To give you an example, when you introduced me, you talk about my experience or my work with Latin America and the work of the Latin American Youth Network for Democracy in the whole region. I was recently in Bolivia, having interviews with the new constitutional government in that country, and they gave a lot of information about how the Cuban Communist medical brigades actually were used by the Cuban regime to take possession of the state security in Bolivia. To give you an example, from 702 professionals or medical professionals that were working as doctors in Bolivia, 497 did not have a medical degree. 497 were presumably agents of the Cuban state security. So that the big inversion that the Bolivian state, that the Bolivian taxpayer made in public health, bringing supposedly Cuban doctors to work on Bolivia, was actually money given to the Cuban state security to undermine the Bolivian sovereignty. But that's not only something that happened in Bolivia, that also happened in Brazil. And that's one of the main missions of these Cuban Communist medical brigades in the whole region, because the Cuban dictatorship cannot exist without this kind of penetration, without the interference in the internal businesses of other countries, and especially in the region. Of course, these medical brigades are not just used as a way to undermine democracy and sovereignty in other countries. They are also one of the fundamental source of money for the dictatorship. It's a way to profit. I mean, it is not charity, it's human trafficking. And I want to be very clear in this aspect, because it's not my opinion, it's not the opinion of the opposition. I mean, when we talk about human trafficking, when we talk about forced labor, which is the way to say slavery, or is the modern slavery, and when we talk about these terms, which are actually technical terms, we are quoting the special rapporteurs of the UN that made a very concise, but I would say a very honest and useful report on the several denounces that they received from the part of the Cuban doctors that got to escape, that managed to escape from these medical brigades in several parts of the region and actually the world. This report actually establishes that based on all these denounces, the activity of the Cuban regime with these Cuban communist medical brigades is actually forced labor. Doctors cannot get married in these missions. Doctors cannot travel. Actually, they have no passport while they are in the foreign countries. They do not receive their actual salary. And this is very important, because we start by saying that this is a very profitable activity for the Cuban regime. To give you an example, Portugal, they gave the Cuban regime, the government of Portugal, give actually, because my understanding is that the medical brigade is still working in Portugal. They gave the Cuban regime around 50,000 euros for each doctor in that country. The amount of money that the regime gets to keep of this 50,000 euros is around the 80% of that money. So that the Cuban doctor receive less than the 20% of the money that they actually earn working in Portugal. In Venezuela, that percentage is even less. It gets to be around between the 5 and the 10% of the real salary, so that the most part of the money goes directly to the Cuban regime, which is not just earning money in a very in which is actually a criminal activity, which is human trafficking and forced labor, but it's also using this money to repress their own people inside the island and to increase their penetration among the region and to be honest also among the world, because they are not only, and when I say they, I'm talking about the Cuban intelligence system, and I will make a quick parenthesis here because I think it's important to understand that when we are talking about a dictatorship as the Cuban dictatorship, when we are talking about a communist totalitarian state, we are also talking, in the case of Cuba, we are talking about a very well-trained and experienced intelligence apparatus. An intelligence apparatus that was well-trained by the KGB and by the Stasi, and that still has connections with countries that are actually enemies of the free world, and it could be the intelligence apparatus of Russia right now, or China, and even Iran. And this intelligence apparatus is actually the one that take the decisions and that govern in the island, and that coordinates the penetration and the interference in the internal businesses of other countries, as it could be Venezuela or Brazil or Bolivia or countries among, or other countries beyond our region. For instance, this intelligence apparatus is the one that is in charge of the repression against the military defectors in the Maduro's dictatorship inside Venezuela, in the Venezuelan prisons. And this is only an example of what they do, and they are also a big part of these medical missions. And I'm going to end my parenthesis to talk about how this intelligence apparatus is also interested in penetrating and interfering in international organizations, as the Pan American Health Organization, as the World Health Organization, as the United Nations that Carlos mentioned recently, as the OAS. They have been also trying to penetrate the OAS and to force decisions among international bodies. And they sometimes succeed. And this has been the case, for instance, of the Pan American Health Organization, that has been part of the human trafficking activities of the Cuban dictatorship, because in each contract which is a state within the Latin American region, also the Pan American Health Organization is involved. Actually, right now, the Attorney General in Florida start a case against the Pan American Health Organization because of participation, because of its part in the human trafficking. Because any of this, and that's why it's so important to talk about this, and that's why it's so important that the audience, the public, the American taxpayers that are also donors of the Pan American Health Organization and the World Health Organization, it's important everybody to know how some of these bodies are actually involved in criminal activities that are not just profitable activities, and also activities against the sovereignty of several countries, are activities against the stability of the region, are activities against the national security of several countries, including United States. And of course, in this business, PAHO also took a portion of the money that should go to pay the salaries of the Cuban doctors. And I have to say, because I haven't said it so far and I have to do it, that I truly believe that the Cuban doctors, the ones that are actually doctors, they do the best of their ability to try to help people. They do the best of their ability to try to bring some coins to their families on the island. They even accept the very unfair rules of the dictatorship. They accept to be a slave in order to have some coins to be able to put food in the in their houses for their families. But the reality is that they have been abused by the dictatorship, and they are not the only ones that goes abroad in these Cuban communist medical brigades. And it is in our hands to stop that. I have to say that I totally agree with the decision of the Trump administration of cutting the funds to the Pan American Health Organization, at least until all this is well explained and the ones that are responsible for this criminal activity actually face justice, because justice is what is lacking in the whole process. Justice for the Cuban doctors, justice for the Cuban people, and for the Latin American citizens that have been mocked in the whole situation. And of course, I have to say that human trafficking, communist medical brigades are not the only criminal activity of the Cuban dictatorship. Recently, Newsweek quote experts from the Pentagon that were alerting about the participation of the Cuban dictatorship in the drug dealer activities, especially with Venezuela and with Colombia. And all this is, of course, a matter of national security for the United States, but it's also a very worrying activity now, because everything in the midst of the COVID-19, everything is worse. For instance, recruitment activities has increased, and narco traffickers in the region, especially in countries with security risk, because of the lack of attention that now governments can give to this kind of law enforcement, because all the other emergencies that they are facing. And there is a situation that the Cuban dictatorship has been using, or has used in the past in several times, when crisis hit a point of no return, or hit a very critical point in the island. And it's not a secret for anybody in the States that people escape from dictatorships. People escape from oppression. People have been actually escaping from Venezuela, and that has resulted in a huge crisis for the whole region, including United States, but especially Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, the countries that are adjacent to Venezuela. And those forced migratory movements are also used by the regime, are also used by the Cuban intelligence apparatus to penetrate the other states with their agents, and have been used by Cuba by the Cuban dictatorship, I have to say, during decades, to penetrate even United States. And the crisis in Cuba is so terrible right now that we have started to to hear comments about the possibility of an exodus, of an stampede, given the very bad conditions that Cubans are facing right now. I have to say that in a way, this has been happening during the last years, not in the way of rafters, but in the way of people living, escaping to countries in Latin America and walking through Latin America to try to get to the United States. But this is a risk right now. And historically, that risk has been, in my opinion, very bad handled by the American administrations that in a way have been blackmailed by the Cuban dictatorship, trying to avoid a crisis, trying to stop the instability. And I have to say very clearly now, the way to stop the threat to the stability is not by appeasement, it's by changing the system. It's by helping the Cuban people to overcome that dictatorship. And that's what we try to do with Cuba Decide. We move the people inside the island, but also the international community, also the international organizations, but also those in position of power. And I'm talking about the heads of the government, the head of the democracies in the region, for which this problem is not only a foreign problem, but it's also a threat to their national security, to their stability, to their sovereignty. We try to move all these actors and all these factors inside and outside the island to force a change of system. Of course, the Cuban people, the Cuban families inside and outside the island, all that we have is our voice and our bodies. And we do it in a very peaceful way. We go and we claim and we protest for our rights. But we also need, such as the Venezuelan people needs and the Nicaraguan people needs, and anyone facing a dictatorship or an intelligence apparatus that is a criminal apparatus ready to repress the people, we need also the international action. We need that those that has the ability to use the language of the force to be ready to use it against those that actually use the force and the violence against their own citizens, against the families. That's why it's so important to work in a united way, international community and citizenry, because that's what we are talking about when we talk about opposition in the midst of a totalitarian regime. We are talking about families that are ready to face even death to try to obtain freedom, to obtain a possibility to pursue happiness in a free way. We need that international community be ready to support that families, be ready to support that societies that are asking for liberation. And that's what we do. That's what we try to do. That's what we provide with an initiative of Cuba Decide, which peacefully ask for real changes, for a change in the system, trying to force that criminal dictatorship to submit to the will of the people, which is actually the base of any democratic state, which is also the base of any legitimate and democratic change. So we also need the voices and the actions of the international community in the direction of supporting directly with humanitarian aid the people, but also in the direction to be ready to be a threat to those that are a real threat against the citizens and against our families. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Oh, excellent, excellent. You cover a lot. You really cover from the structure of the regime to the structure and human rights violations, human trafficking, and the relationship with Venezuela. You cover a lot. We have to think a lot of the things that you mentioned here. When we read in the news that Algeria gave $70 million to Cuba, a country that the Algeria regime is going to give $70 million to Cuba for the Cuban doctors, that we saw the image of López Obrador, and I was sure about this when López Obrador was a candidate. It was not about COVID-19. It was about fulfilling his promise to the Cuban regime to maintain the Cuban regime. It's not about COVID-19. It's not about the people of Mexico. It's about López Obrador supporting his friends in Cuba, bringing the missions to support with oil and with money the Phoenician regime, the gerontocratic Phoenician regime. It is about that. You talk about the abuse. You talk about how the Cuban regime has been abusing these poor doctors, these poor practitioners that travel around the world, receive sometimes only 10% of the money. The Cuban regime profit from the exploitation, profit from the human traffic, profit from the abuse. And that's not the only people abused by the Cuban regime. You know that the Cubans internally in Cuba have been abused for years and years and years from the regime. When we hear about the tourist industry from Canada to Cuba and how they exploit the women and the men in Cuba as sexual workers to satisfy the Canadians who love to travel to Cuba, that is not acceptable. It's not acceptable exploitation. So there are some important points there. We have some questions here with the audience that they more clarification. This one that is easy. How many Cuban brigades? There are more than 21. They are growing by the minute because some countries, South Africa, Argentina, Italy, they also has been taking the opportunity and the excuse from COVID-19 because there is no justification. They just take the excuse. But I wanted to just go to one of the questions here. As a former Catholic and majority country, is the Catholic Church represented in Cuba? This is a different topic, but I want to cover some of the questions. Do you think that the Catholic Church, and there are several critics about the role of the Catholic Church. There are some good and bad reviews. What do you think, about the Catholic Church in Cuba?
Well, I am myself a Catholic, and I was formed within the Catholic Church inside the island, and I think that the most part of the people of God in Cuba, and I'm talking about the priests, the nuns, but also the laicity, they are suffering the same as any member of the Cuban people, and they are accompanying that suffering. They are also under the same blackmail that each citizen is in Cuba. They are actually even more repressed than any regular citizen, because it's not a secret for anyone that churches and religion in the midst of totalitarian communism is subversive by nature. It's not something, it's something that even escapes from the will of the bishops and the church. Is subversive, but because the gospel says truth will set you free, and truth and freedom are against and incompatible with a totalitarian regime. I have to say that in my opinion, the public image of the church was for many years kidnapped by the regime, in the sense of conditioning the public speeches of the bishops, especially from the former cardinal Monsignor Jaime Ortega Lamino, and also in my personal opinion, that that perception was unfair to the reality of the Cuban church and to the will of the people of God in Cuba. sadly, we live inside a dictatorship that is governed and repressed by a criminal intelligence apparatus. That intelligence apparatus is also among the church, as it is among any institution or organization inside the island. That's not a critic or a judgment. That's just a reality. That's just something with we have to deal, and I hope we could overcome in their due time. And sadly, the church activities in general are always under the conditioning will of the dictatorship. I have to say that there is an institution within the Cuban Communist Party which exclusive mission is to surveillance, to repress, and to condition the churches in Cuba, especially the Catholic Church. That's something that is not new and is not exclusive of Cuba. I mean, the Polish Church also suffering. Each church in communist regime have suffered that, and we are talking about a country that say 6 decades ago expelled almost more than the third part of the clergy from the island. That was one of the first actions that Fidel Castro took, and repressed all religious expression for decades in Cuba. For instance, my father, that was killed by the dictatorship 8 years ago, was sent when he was 17 years old in 1968, 1969. He was sent to a forced labor camp, the Cuban gulags. He was sent to a forced labor camp just because he was Catholic. And he was there with people that was there just because they listened to the Beatles or speak English or has a different sexual orientation, or anyone with an alternative expression have been repressed in Cuba. The church is not escaping from that reality, sadly, in my opinion. The public image have been too conditioned by the dictatorship.
We have different expression of support here. I'm gonna read one. One is, first, I want to thank you, Rosa Maria from Lorraine, for this conversation. It's so valuable. I want to express my tremendous admiration. Rosa Maria, you're an incredible woman. Non-stop dedication should be recognized. She's making incredible progress and getting so many people for the freedom and human rights in Cuba, as well, meeting this urgent need of Cubans on the island. Then you have, talking about the religious freedom in Cuba, because there's a difference between the Catholic Church as an institution and the role, the political role with the regime, sometimes maintaining some relationship with the regime, the role of the Pope not engaging in human rights, not engaging in democracy, and allowing some regimes to continue the work. But some work from some priests, and I know a lot of priests working with dedication internally in Cuba and Matanzas, in different places in Cuba, really active, but also pastors, people from different religion, pastors from different religion, like Mario Leonardo, who left the island. He says his best that after a while working in Cuba, the Cuban torture and persecution, and the Cuban regime forced them to leave. So you have different message here directly to you. I'm gonna send you those messages later. That's a question here. What do you think there's so little or no coverage in the mainstream media in the US on the Cuban regime responsibility importing COVID-19 in the island with the arrival of passengers in a cruise ship who were infected by the virus, and in general about the humanitarian crisis there? COVID-19 and the Cuban regime response. A problem?
That's a very good question, because there is a very poor coverage of the Cuban situation in general, and this is very frustrating, given the fact that Cuba is so close to United States and has been affecting in so many ways also the reality in the States, and have been a threat for decades right now to the national security to this country. I have to say that I don't have all the facts. I don't have all the answers, but what I do have is the experience of how good is the Cuban propaganda machinery. For how long they have been targeting United States media outlets, United States academies, and I'm talking about universities, and targeting also social movements in United States. I mean, everybody should remember the spy network, the WASP network, La Red Avispa, that even had people in the Pentagon, I mean, senior advisors in the Pentagon, senior advisors for Cuban issues, were actually Cuban spies working inside the Pentagon. And I'm talking about Ana Belén Montes, which is right now in a federal prison in the States. She sadly was not an exclusive example. There are Cuban spies, even American citizens, that are working for the Cuban communist regime inside the bureaucratic structures of this country. And this is a real threat. This is a big threat, given the fact that the Cuban regime is a criminal organization and works with other criminal organizations and kleptocracies in the world to undermine democracy in the region, but also to gain influence within United States. They use all this influence and all this power to darken the real situation in the island, to make you talk about the embargo and not, or the blockade, and not, as they call it, and not about the Cuban suffering because of the lack of freedom and the lack of food. And they have the resources of an state. They have the experience of 60 decades to do so. And in the other side of the table, what we have is our bodies. What we have are Cuban families trying to explain themselves and fighting with such a big propaganda machinery that was able to transform an ice cold killer as Ernesto Che Guevara in a symbol, in the Mickey Mouse of the international left. We are dealing with that machinery, with a machinery that has been able to create several of the biggest lies of the 20th century, and it's trying to do the same in the 21st century. So we need all of you. We need all the people that is right now watching this, and those that are not doing so, to speak their minds and to help us to explain the truth, and to help us also to act on that truth. Because what is happening right now is that the root of the evil, which is the name of this conversation, and that root of the evil that is the Cuban communist intelligence apparatus, their criminal activities and their dictatorship, is a non-stopping machinery. While we are talking, they are acting. So we need to act in consequence.
You know, we have like 47 questions here, and we don't have time for all the questions. We will need a program just for these questions. Well, can you briefly, there's several questions here to comment about the situation in other countries. There is somebody here talking about the situation in India and how in some part of India there is all this Cuban propaganda, and in Kerala, in India, the communist government has been having the propaganda. We have to remember Angola. But there's a specific question about, just briefly, what you have to say about Nicaragua in just 1 minute. And let's do this. Talk about Nicaragua, and then we're only going to have like 3 minutes more. So a future for Cuba. Nicaragua, 1 minute, and a future for Cuba. From Fidel to Raúl, to Diaz-Canel, and hope is not in the air. So what do we need to expect for Cuba? 2 final questions. And thank you for being here. And I want to invite everyone to join us next week, that we're going to have Maria Warlow, who can answer some of these specific questions about the Cuban doctors.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Carlos. And Nicaragua is very close to my heart. I have many Nicaraguan friends that are facing threats right now within Nicaragua and abroad from this already sanguinary dictatorship that is Daniel Ortega's dictatorship, and that has been also a close allied and kind of a pupil for of the Cuban dictatorship. They got to the point in which they passed a law in that parliament that is, of course, the parliament of Daniel Ortega, because they expelled from parliament all the deputies that were not loyal to the regime. They even passed a law asking for military help of Cuba and Venezuela. They got to this point of cynicism, and I have to say that I'm also frustrated that the situation in Nicaragua, as terrible as it is not the scandal that it should be, and it's not receiving the support and the attention that they should receive. Sadly, Nicaragua situation, Venezuelan situation, what could be the Bolivian situation, that all these centers of instability, of these autocratic regimes, all these dictatorships in their beginnings or flourishing, as it is the case of Venezuela, none of this could be possible without the action, the coordination, the support of the Cuban dictatorship and the Cuban intelligence apparatus. That's why they are the root of the evil. And that's why we have to be radicals in the sense of going to the root of the problem and targeting the Cuban dictatorships and the Cuban criminals as the source of the instability, because helping the Cuban people and eliminating the Cuban dictatorship is a necessary step in order to have stability, peace, and a flourishing democracy in the rest of the region. It's not, they are not, there is no competence among dictatorships. We have to attack all of them at the same time, but we have to be very coherent when we talk about the problem, because we need to have the accurate diagnosis in order to act in an intelligent and in a definitive way. And going to your second questions, I in the middle of all these calamities, I'm hopeful and I have faith in the Latin American people, in the Venezuelan people, in the Nicaraguan people, in the Cuban people. I mean, the amount of protest in the midst of the worst repression that we have lived in the last years are unbelievable. The people is actually is furious because of the situation, and they are more and more ready and willing to act. Of course, there is a lot of fear because there is a criminal apparatus and a criminal government ready to act also. That's why we need both. We need the Cuban people, but we also need the international community. And if you want to be part of this movement, because you can be part of the movement regardless of your citizenry, your citizenship, or the point of the world in which you are, please join us. You can find us in cubadecide.org. That's Cuba Decide without the S, cubadecide.org. And if you want to help directly with in a humanitarian way, you can also join us in cubaincrisis.org, which is cubaincrisis.org. Both platforms are to the disposal of anyone that want to help us, that want to help the Cuban people, that want to overcome that big propaganda machinery and take all the prismas that the Cuban people have to suffer, because we also have to suffer. For instance, the fact that there is an anti-American feeling in a lot of countries and citizens, and that's a fact. And that's a fact that has been exploited by the Cuban dictatorship, saying that they are against the Yankees and trying to canalize those anti-Yankee feelings that there are in the world, also as a support to the Cuban dictatorship. Everything is very unfair. That is mainly unfair to the Cuban people, to their truth, to their suffering. But today, that threat that is the Cuban dictatorship, that criminal apparatus that is the Cuban dictatorship, is also very vulnerable. It's vulnerable because their propaganda machinery is big, but it's cracking. It's vulnerable because their structure is old and it's also cracking. There is no Fidel Castro anymore. There is no Hugo Chavez anymore. And we have just to hope that there is no eternal lies anymore. We live in a world of internet and communications, and we are a click. The longest distance right now is just a click to actually know about the Cuban situation and to actually do something to help the Cuban people and the rest of the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosa Maria. Really good conversation, in-deep knowledge about the reality in Cuba. You continue engagement all the time, traveling to Cuba, maintaining your organization operating in Cuba. Thank you very much. For the people who wants to support Cuba Decide, the work, please connect with them, connect to donate time, connect to donate money. I have been joining this fight for the freedom in Cuba for many, many years, and it's because of the people, also the Cuban fighters, because of the people that love Cuba and they have been working so much to free their country, even with the worst regime. Thank you very much, Rosa Maria. I hope that we're gonna have you again to answer all those questions. Sorry about those questions. We will keep those questions and try to organize another program with Rosa Maria. Too many questions. And please join us next week. Next Thursday, we're gonna have Maria Werlow, who also has been really active, exposing these medical brigades, and she has been very active exposing the relationship between Cuba, Venezuela, narco-traffic, and all the things that are going on there. In the name of Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, thank you for joining us, and please recommend this program, and this program is going to be also available in YouTube. Thank you very much for your participation today. Thank you, Rosa Maria.